The grand chamber of the Galactic Assembly stretched upward like a cathedral built for gods, not mortals. And Ambassador Chen stood at its center, feeling smaller than an atom in the vast universe beyond these walls. 70 years had passed since humanity first stepped onto this station with wide eyes and eager hearts, ready to join the great community of intelligent species that ruled the stars. And 70 years had taught them that eagerness was a weakness the galaxy exploited without mercy around. Chen, in ascending circles, sat the representatives of 247 species, each in their designated seats, each watching the human with expressions that ranged from contempt to pity to carefully masked fear. And none with anything resembling friendship. The Vraxian High Commander loomed largest in Chun's vision, his 6 arms folded in a gesture that meant finality among his people, his Katona's face reflecting the cold lights of the chamber. In shades of deep purple and black, the vote is concluded. The Vraxian's voice boomed through translation devices that turned his clicks and whistles into something human ears could process. Resolution 7743 has passed with overwhelming support. Chen felt their jaw tighten, but kept their face neutral the way decades of diplomatic training had taught them. Even as their mind calculated what this resolution meant for every human in the galaxy, the terms were clear and brutal. Humanity must dismantle 70% of their military fleet within 6 standard months, surrender administrative control of their 12 outer colonies to protective supervision by the Vraxian hegemony, and accept permanent restrictions on their population growth, technological development, and territorial expansion. In other words, humanity must agree to slowly die. The Sara representative, a serpentine creature whose scales shimmered like oil on water, raised her head to speak. The human species has demonstrated concerning patterns of aggression and rapid expansion that mirror the historical profiles of the destroyers who nearly ended all galactic civilization 3 millennia ago. We present no threat, Chen said, their voice steady despite the rage building in their chest like a sun going nova. Our population density is lower than 70% of assembly species. Our military is purely defensive, and our expansion has only occurred in unclaimed systems far from established territories. That is what they all say at first. The Loomer delegate chimed, his crystalline body resonating with harmonics that the translators converted into words. The destroyers also claimed peaceful intentions until the day they began consuming entire star systems. Chen wanted to scream that humanity was nothing like the ancient horror that haunted the galaxy's collective nightmares, that this comparison was based on paranoia rather than evidence, that every restrictive treaty over the past 70 years had been justified with the same excuses. Instead, they looked toward the Tyrellian section where Ambassador Veln sat with her, 4 eyes downcast. Refusing to meet Chen's gaze, the Tyrellians had been humanity's first friends in the galaxy and their closest allies for 50 years. Sharing technology and culture, fighting side by side against pirates in the neutral zones, building something that felt like genuine partnership. But when the vote came, the Tyrellians had abstained, not voted against humanity, which would have been honest, but abstained, which was somehow worse, because it meant they knew this was wrong but lacked the courage to say so. Ambassador Chen, the assembly chairman, said from his elevated platform at the chamber's peak, his aged face worn by centuries of mediating galactic politics. Does humanity accept the terms of Resolution 7743? The question hung in the recycled air of the station like a blade suspended by spider silk. And Chen knew that every human watching this broadcast back on Earth and across the colonies was holding their breath. 3 options presented themselves in Chen's mind with crystal clarity. They could accept the terms and watch humanity slowly suffocate, under restrictions designed to keep them weak and contained. Forever, they could reject the terms and face immediate sanctions, blockades, and possibly military intervention by the combined forces of species who outnumbered humanity 1,000 to 1. They could choose the third option, the one that had been discussed in secret meetings in the deepest bunkers on Earth, the one that military command and civilian leadership had war-gamed endlessly, the one that terrified and exhilarated in equal measure. Chen straightened their spine and spoke clearly so that every translator in the chamber, and every human across light years of space would hear without confusion the human species withdraws from the Galactic Assembly effective immediately, Chen said, and the chamber erupted into chaos. All treaties, agreements, and obligations accepted upon our admission to this body are hereby declared null and void. The Varaxian commander slammed 3 of his arms against his desk, creating a sound like thunder. You cannot simply leave. The treaties are binding under galactic law. Galactic law applies only to members of the Assembly, Chen replied, pulling a data chip from their pocket and holding it up for the cameras. This chip contains formal documentation of humanity's withdrawal, along with detailed legal analysis, showing that every species has the right to revoke membership. A right exercised by the Catharan Empire 600 years ago when they felt the Assembly no longer served their interests. The chairman's face paled to a shade that suggested he remembered that precedent very well and understood its implications if you leave. You will have no protection under Assembly law, the Sara representative hissed, her hood flaring in agitation. No trade agreements, no mutual defense, no access to common resources or neutral zones, we're aware. Chen said simply, you'll be alone. The Lumori delegate chimed with something that might have been concern. A single species against a galaxy that views you with suspicion? We've been alone since we arrived, Chen replied. And the truth of those words resonated through the chamber because everyone present knew it was true. You've spent 70 years making sure we understood we would never truly belong here, never be trusted, never be allowed to grow beyond the small box you constructed for us. Chen walked toward the exit, their footsteps echoing in the sudden silence that had fallen. Over the Assembly at the threshold, they paused and looked back at the 247 species who had just voted to cage humanity's future. You wanted us gone, Chen said. You wanted humanity to be small and manageable and unthreatening. So congratulations on getting exactly what you wished for. You're making a grave mistake. The Varaxian commander growled. You have no idea what you're unleashing. Chen smiled without humor and spoke their final words to the Galactic Assembly. You're right that we're unleashing something, Chen said. For 70 years you've seen what humans can do when we're constantly asking for permission. Constantly held back by treaties designed to limit us. Constantly forced to be less than we could be. Chen's smile widened, and for just a moment the Varaxian commander's expression shifted to something that might have been fear. Now you'll get to see what humanity can do when we stop asking. The door closed behind Ambassador Chen with a soft hiss, sealing off the chamber and everything it represented, and across human space from Earth to the furthest colony. Billions of people watched their representative walk away from 70 years of restraint and into an unknown future. The age of humanity asking permission was over. What came next would be entirely up to them. The broadcast reached Earth 17 minutes after Ambassador Chen walked out of the Galactic Assembly chamber, and Maya Rodriguez watched it from her apartment in New Jakarta while her coffee grew cold and her trembling hands around the globe and across every human colony. Billions of people stopped what they were doing and stared at screens, showing their representative, declaring independence from the very galactic civilization humanity had fought so hard to join. Maya, his first emotion was fear that gripped her stomach like ice water because she understood what the Assembly could do to species that defied them. She had studied the histories of civilizations that had been sanctioned and blockaded until they collapsed from within. Her second emotion surprised her because it was relief for her entire adult life. Maya had worked as a quantum engineer, developing computational systems that could have revolutionized human technology. But every breakthrough she made was immediately classified and restricted under Assembly Treaty 47, which limited the processing power any member species could deploy. She had watched her work gather dust in government archives, while the problems it could solve went unsolved. All because the Assembly decided that humans with advanced computation posed some theoretical threat to galactic stability. Now those treaties meant nothing. Maya pulled up her secure government terminal and found it flooded with messages from colleagues across the solar system, all asking the same question in different ways. Were they really free to pursue the research they had been forced to abandon? Within the hour, an answer came through official channels that made Maya's heart race. The Prometheus protocol was active. She had heard rumors about Prometheus in whispers exchanged between researchers who dared to dream of a future without restrictions. A contingency plan developed over decades in secret facilities that officially didn't exist now. Those secrets were spilling into the light in Mars. In the Hellas Basin, where official records showed only agricultural domes, massive hangar doors opened to reveal shipyards that had been constructed piece by piece over 30 years. Hidden in plain sight beneath environmental shields that blocked scanner detection, new ships emerged into the thin Martian atmosphere, their hulls gleaming with alloys that assembly treaties had classified as military grade and therefore forbidden to humanity. Captain Sarah Okonkwo stood on the bridge of the UHS Defiance. One of those forbidden ships felt a mixture of pride and terror as her vessel rose above the red planet. She had spent 15 years working on this ship in secret, living a double life where her official records said she managed atmospheric processors, while her real work involved building humanity's hidden insurance policy, all systems operational, her engineering officer reported. A young man named Liu, who looked like he might cry from joy or fear, or both. Fusion core running at 98% efficiency, weapon systems online. Stealth fields engaged. Take us to the rendezvous point, Sarah ordered. Let's see what else Prometheus has been hiding. The answer came as the Defiance joined a fleet that materialized from hiding spots across the solar system. Asteroid mining operations that were secretly construction yards. Research stations studying deep space phenomena that were actually weapons development facilities. And colony ships that had been officially decommissioned but were actually retrofitted as mobile bases. Admiral David Zhao addressed the assembled fleet from his flagship, his weathered face filling screens across 200 vessels. For 70 years, we've built our civilization under rules designed to keep us small, Zhao said, his voice carrying the weight of decades spent preparing for this moment. We followed those rules because we believed cooperation was worth the cost. But the assembly made it clear today that no amount of cooperation will ever be enough for them. Across human space, people listened to their admiral outline what came next. Fleet would not attack anyone because humanity was not seeking war. But they would defend human territory with everything they had. And they would begin expanding into unclaimed systems that the assembly had forbidden them to settle. Research facilities would immediately begin developing technologies that treaties had banned. Advanced artificial intelligence, self-replicating construction systems, quantum computing networks, and faster-than-light drives that could surpass assembly standards. Population restrictions were lifted, allowing colonies to grow at natural rates instead of the artificial limits imposed by assembly demographers, who claimed they were preventing overcrowding, but were actually preventing growth on Europa. Beneath kilometers of ice where humanity had built their largest off-world city, Governor Chen Liu called an emergency session of the colonial parliament. We're not beholden to assembly safety standards anymore, Chen Liu said, reading from the list of restrictions that had just been voided. We can expand the city into the subsurface ocean, build the deep water facilities that could support 10 million people instead of the 2 million. We're limited to now. One of the parliament members, an older woman named Yuki who had immigrated from Earth 40 years ago, raised a concern that many shared. What if the assembly blockades us? Yuki asked, what if they decide to make an example of humanity and cut us off from resources we need to survive? It was a valid fear because humanity still depended on trade with other species for certain rare elements and specialized technologies, but the response came not from Governor Chen Liu but from Admiral Zhao on a priority channel broadcast to every human settlement. We've been preparing for that possibility, Zhao said. Every essential resource we imported from assembly sources has a backup supply chain we've been developing in secret. And every critical technology we relied on has a human-made alternative that's been waiting for permission to deploy. The truth was that humanity had spent decades quietly becoming self-sufficient, while pretending to need the assembly's trade networks, building redundancies and alternatives, and backup plans for scenarios exactly like this on Titan. In the methane seas where humanity had established their most distant colony, Director Amara Ase watched her screens. Fill with new project approvals that had been blocked for years. Her facility studied xenobiology and had made discoveries about alien life that could revolutionize medicine and agriculture. But assembly regulations required all such research to be shared with the central database and subject to approval before implementation. Amara had watched species after species take credit for discoveries her team made, profiting from human research while humans were required to pay licensing fees to use their own breakthroughs. The data locks were removed and her team could actually apply their discoveries to help humanity. Within days, new medical treatments began rolling out across human space. Therapies for diseases that had plagued humanity for generations. Agricultural techniques that could double crop yields in harsh environments. And biological insights that promised to extend human lifespans. Significantly, the galaxy watched these developments. With growing alarm, the Vraxian High Commander convened an emergency session of the Assembly Security Council and demanded immediate action. The humans are developing forbidden technologies, he declared, his mandibles clicking in agitation. They're building military vessels, expanding into restricted zones, and violating every safety protocol we established to prevent another destroyer scenario. But the Assembly was paralyzed by politics. Tyrellians argued that humanity had the right to withdraw from treaties they found unjust. And several smaller species quietly agreed while remaining publicly silent. The Sara wanted immediate military intervention. But the logistics of mounting a campaign against a species that had spent decades preparing for exactly that scenario gave pause even to the Hawks. Meanwhile, human expansion continued at a pace that stunned Galactic. Observers' colony ships departed Earth every week, heading for systems that had been off-limits under assembly law, carrying populations eager to build new worlds without restrictions. Maya Rodriguez found herself on one of those ships. Recruited to establish a quantum computing research facility on a planet called Nova Terra that orbited a star 40 light-years from Earth, she stood at the observation window watching Earth shrink behind them and felt the weight of 70 years of limitations lifting from her shoulders. "We're really doing this?" her colleague whispered beside her. A physicist named James, who had spent his career dreaming of experiments the assembly forbade. "We're going to see what humanity can really accomplish." Maya nodded and smiled, because for the first time in her life, she believed that humanity's potential was limited only by their imagination and courage, not by fearful aliens who saw threats in every innovation. The unshackling was complete, and humanity was finally free to become whatever they chose to. Beatty Galaxy would simply have to adjust. 5 years had transformed humanity in ways that made the Galactic Assembly's worst fears seem almost quaint in retrospect. And Ambassador Chen stood in the observation deck of humanity's newest flagship, watching construction drones swarm around the skeleton of a massive station that would serve as the hub for their expanded civilization. The numbers told a story that made galactic analysts recalculate their models repeatedly because they couldn't believe what their data showed. Humanity had grown from 12 colonies to 63. Settlements spread across 50 star systems. Their population had surged from 20 billion to 35 billion as the old restrictions evaporated. And their technological capabilities had leaped forward by what some estimates suggested was 2 or 3 generations in just 5 years. Maya Rodriguez's quantum computing breakthrough had revolutionized everything from navigation to resource management, allowing human ships to calculate FTL jumps with precision that made the Assembly's best navigators look like children with toy compasses. But the real game-changer was the Prometheus drive. Dr. Sarah Chen, no relation to the ambassador, had led a team of engineers in developing an FTL system that approached the problem from an entirely different angle than the Assembly's standard drives, which relied on creating bubbles in space-time that ships could ride like surfers on cosmic waves. The Prometheus drive instead created temporary wormholes between 2 points in space, allowing instantaneous travel across distances that would take weeks or months. Using conventional FTLIT was twice as fast as anything the Assembly had, used half the power, and was small enough to fit in vessels that the old drives would have been too massive to equip. Sarah Chen watched the first successful test from a safe distance, her heart pounding as the UHS Pathfinder vanished from local space and reappeared 40 light-years away in less time than it took to blink it works. Her assistant breathed beside her, and Sarah felt tears streaming down her face because this was what human ingenuity could accomplish when it wasn't being strangled by fearful regulations. But humanity's expansion hadn't gone unnoticed by the species that had voted to contain them, the Vraxian High. Commander Turvale stared at the tactical displays, showing human settlements blooming across previously unclaimed space, like a rash spreading across skin. And his multiple hands clenched in barely controlled fury, they grow like a plague, he hissed to his war council. In 5 years, they've expanded more than most species manage in 50, and their technology advances at rates that suggest they've been hiding there. True capabilities all along, the truth was exactly that. Humanity had been hiding capabilities for decades, developing weapons and defenses in secret while appearing to comply with assembly restrictions. And now those hidden cards were being revealed one by one. Torrivel's intelligence officers reported that human ships were equipped with weapon systems that violated at least 30 different assembly treaties. From plasma cannons that could burn through standard shielding like paper, to missile systems that used AI guidance prohibited under the Synthetic Intelligence Accords. We must act now, Turville declared, before they grow strong enough to threaten us directly. He gathered support from the Sara Collective and several other species, who shared his paranoia about humanity's potential, assembling a coalition fleet of over 300 vessels to enforce what he called galactic stability. The plan was to blockade key human systems and force them back to the negotiating table where new treaties could be imposed through threat of military force. Admiral Zhao watched the coalition fleet mass at the TOHE border of human space and felt a cold calculation settle over his mind as he prepared for the confrontation he had known was inevitable. They outnumber us 3-1, his tactical officer observed, her voice tight with tension. And their ships are larger than ours. On average, larger doesn't always mean better, Zhao replied. And they're used to fighting enemies who play by their rules. Humanity had spent 5 years learning to fight differently, to use speed and precision instead of raw power, to strike from unexpected angles and disengage before enemy vessels could respond effectively. But Zhao had no intention of making this a military confrontation if he could avoid it, because war was expensive and unpredictable, and there was a better weapon available. Ambassador Chen received Zhao's plan and smiled grimly as they prepared the broadcast that would change everything. Message went out across all galactic communication channels simultaneously, impossible to block or suppress, and within hours every species in the assembly was hearing truths that had been carefully hidden for millennia. Chen appeared on screens from one side of the galaxy to the other, their face calm and their voice steady as they began to speak. For 70 years, humanity operated under the assumption that the Galactic Assembly represented a genuine community of equals, cooperating for mutual benefit, Chen said. We were wrong. The evidence that followed had been gathered over years of careful research by human intelligence operatives, piecing together fragments from abandoned databases, classified archives, and whispered conversations with species who had been victims of the same system that targeted humanity. Chen revealed that the Assembly had used the same playbook against 17 other species over the past 3,000 years, claiming they showed concerning patterns similar to the ancient destroyers, imposing restrictive treaties that prevented technological or territorial growth and crushing those who refused to comply. 3 species had been driven to complete extinction when they attempted to break free from assembly control, their homeworlds bombarded from orbit and their populations scattered to the stellar winds as examples to others who might consider defiance. Catharan Empire that Chen had mentioned during their walkout had actually been destroyed 200 years after their withdrawal from the assembly, though official records claimed they had fallen to internal strife rather than external intervention. The assembly isn't a democracy or a community, Chen continued. It's an oligarchy designed to maintain the power of the elder species by preventing younger civilizations from developing technologies or populations that might challenge the established order? Chen showed graphs comparing the growth rates of assembly member species to independent civilizations, demonstrating that membership correlated with stagnation, while independence correlated with development. They call it stability, Chen said. But it's really just fear dressed up as wisdom. The broadcast ended with an invitation to any species tired of assembly restrictions to contact humanity about forming alternative alliances based on actual equality rather than enforced hierarchy. Response was immediate and chaotic across the assembly. Minor species that had spent centuries accepting their place in the galactic order suddenly began asking uncomfortable questions about why their populations remained small, why their technologies lagged behind the elder species, and why they needed permission for developments that seemed obviously beneficial to the Turellian commune, already guilt-ridden over their abstention during humanity's final assembly session. Publicly broke with the council and announced they would seek partnership with humanity instead. Dozens smaller civilizations declared neutrality in any conflict between humans and the assembly, refusing to support either side until they could verify Chen's claims independently. The Varaxian coalition fleet found itself politically isolated as the unified front Terval had counted on began crumbling around him. This changes nothing, Terval insisted during an emergency council session. The humans still represent a threat that must be contained, but even among his own species, voices began questioning whether containment was really about galactic safety or about maintaining Varaxian dominance. The coalition fleet withdrew from human borders without firing a shot, though Terval made sure humanity understood this was a tactical retreat rather than surrender. This isn't over, his final transmission promised. You've won a political victory, but you've also ensured that we'll never trust you. And when the opportunity comes to end your threat permanently, we will take it, Ambassador. Chen watched the Varaxian fleet depart and felt no satisfaction because they knew this. Victory was temporary. Humanity had bought itself time, and allies but had also made enemies who would never forgive or forget. The galaxy was fracturing along new lines, with some species embracing humanity's message of independence, while others clung to the old order out of fear or benefit or simple inertia. Humans and Turellians worked side by side, developing technologies that both species had been forbidden to pursue under assembly. Lamaya Rodriguez found herself collaborating with a Turellian scientist named Valkera, who had spent her career dreaming of experiments the assembly deemed too risky. We're building something new, Valkara said one night as they reviewed their research results. Not the assembly's hierarchy, and not human domination either, but genuine partnership between species who respect each other's potential. Maya hoped she was right, because the alternative was a galaxy divided into hostile camps racing toward an inevitable confrontation. Admiral Shao prepared his fleets for that possibility while praying it wouldn't come. The Deep Space Monitoring Station on the edge of the galaxy had been operating for 3 centuries, maintained by the assembly as an early warning system against threats from the void beyond known space. And when its automated alerts began screaming warnings across every emergency channel simultaneously, the technician on duty thought the system was malfunctioning. Was wrong. Admiral Shao received the alert 17 minutes after it first triggered and felt ice water replace the blood in his veins as he read the sensor data that couldn't possibly be real, but was being confirmed by every human monitoring station within range. Devourers were returning. Humanity knew them from the histories shared by the assembly. Terrible stories passed down through 3,000 years about the ancient enemy that had consumed entire civilizations, harvesting biological matter and energy on a scale that left nothing but dead worlds in their wake. The assembly had united to fight them in a war that lasted 2 generations and cost trillions of lives, finally driving the Devourers back into the dark spaces between galaxies, where everyone had hoped they would never return. Everyone had been wrong about that too. The first Harvester ship emerged from dark space like a nightmare made of metal and flesh, its mass equivalent to a small moon. Its surface a horrifying fusion of biological growths and technological systems that seemed to breathe and pulse as it Moved behind it came more. Dozens of ships, spread across a front, hundreds of light years wide, all moving toward the galaxy's rim where the richest concentrations of habitable worlds awaited. Their hunger the assembly convened in emergency session and descended into chaos within. Minutes the Varaxian High Commander demanded that all species contribute fleets to the common defense, including humanity despite their withdrawn status. Sara Collective insisted that the human question must be resolved before any unified response could be organized, because they couldn't trust humanity to fight alongside them. The Lumori proposed negotiating with the Devourers because surely rational communication could resolve the conflict peacefully, ignoring 3,000 years of evidence that the Devourers didn't negotiate. Days passed in debate while the harvester ships advanced, and the first inhabited system in their path went silent. The colony on Kelvin 3 had been home to 4 million Turellians, a peaceful agricultural world that supplied food to a dozen nearby systems. And when the Devourer ship arrived, it simply began processing everything on the surface. The few ships that escaped brought recordings that the assembly tried to suppress but couldn't contain, showing machines larger than cities descending from orbit and converting soil, water, plants, animals, and people into raw materials that were pumped back up to the harvester ships' enormous holds when the Devourers left 3 days later. Kelvin 3 was a barren rock, stripped of its atmosphere and reduced to its core elements. Assembly continued arguing. Ambassador Chen watched the debates with growing horror and finally decided that humanity couldn't wait for the elder species to overcome their political paralysis. We're going, Chen told Admiral Zhao during a secure transmission, with or without assembly coordination. Zhao had already been preparing the fleet because he had expected exactly this decision. The human armada that departed for the front lines consisted of 120 vessels, small compared to what the assembly could theoretically muster, but representing everything humanity could spare while maintaining defense of their own territory. Captain Sarah Okonkwo stood on the bridge of the UHS Defiance and reviewed the intelligence data on Devourer capabilities. With a sinking feeling in her gut, the enemy ships were massive, heavily armored, and protected by adaptive shielding that evolved in response to weapons fire, learning to deflect whatever was thrown at them and becoming stronger with each engagement. Human weapons had never been tested against such targets. Will adapt, Zhao said when Sarah expressed her concerns. That's what humans do better than anyone. The first human Devourer engagement occurred at the edge of the Kepler system, where a harvester ship was moving toward a mining colony that housed 200,000 humans and Turellians who had refused to evacuate. Sarah led her squadron in the initial attack run, launching missiles that used AI guidance systems the assembly had banned but humanity had continued developing in secret. Missiles struck the harvester ship's shields and detonated with enough force to vaporize a city. But the shields absorbed the impact and flickered briefly before stabilizing target the same location. Sarah ordered, concentrate fire. 3 more squadrons added their weapons to the barrage, pouring energy and explosives into a single point on the harvester ship's shields while it slowly turned to bring its own weapons to bear. For a moment Sarah thought they were succeeding as the shields began to destabilize. But then the harvester ship's surface erupted with organic growth that spread across the weakened area like cancer, reinforcing the shields with biological matter that appeared to be grown specifically for that purpose. It's adapting, her tactical officer reported unnecessarily. Evolving defenses in real time, the harvester ship returned fire with weapons that tore through space itself, creating rifts that swallowed to human destroyers completely and damaged a dozen more vessels. All ships withdraw, Zhao ordered from the command center. Regroup at Rally Point Delta. The human fleet retreated, and Sarah felt shame burning in her chest, because they had accomplished nothing except learning that their weapons were inadequate. The butcher's bill came in an hour later. 27 ships destroyed, another 40 damaged badly enough to require extensive repairs, and 3,000 human lives ended in the span of 30 minutes across the fleet. Morale plummeted as crews realized, we're facing an enemy that could adapt faster than they could adjust tactics. But while the military struggled, human scientists were doing what they did best, analyzing problems and finding creative solutions. Actor Nkosi David worked in the research vessel Archimedes, studying the sensor data from the battle with an intensity that made his eyes burn and his head ache. His specialty was quantum mechanics and neural interface technology, two fields that the assembly had always insisted couldn't be combined safely. But Nkosi had been secretly exploring the intersection for years. He noticed something in the data that made him sit up straight and call his team together urgently. "The shields oscillate," he said, showing them graphs that tracked the energy signatures of the harvester ship's defenses. "They cycle through quantum states at frequencies we can detect." His assistant, a young woman named Lu Fen, frowned at the readings. "But the oscillation is so rapid that weapons can't be timed to strike during the vulnerable phases, not manually," Nkosi agreed. "But what if we use neural interface technology to let the weapon systems predict the oscillation patterns in real time?" The idea was radical and possibly insane because it would require connecting human minds directly to weapons guidance computers, creating a feedback loop that could overwhelm the operators' consciousness if it went wrong. But the alternative was watching the Devourers harvest their way across the galaxy. Unopposed Admiral Zhao approved the research and authorized volunteers to test the neural interface system, and Sarah Okonkwo was the first to step forward. Procedure took 8 hours of surgery to implant the necessary hardware in her brainstem, connecting her consciousness to her ship's targeting computers through pathways that felt alien and uncomfortable. When Sarah opened her eyes afterward, she could feel the defiance around her like an extension of her own body, sensing every system and weapon as naturally as she felt her own limbs. The second engagement with the Devourers happened 3 weeks after the first, and this time, the human fleet came equipped with weapons, guided by neural interface operators who could feel the quantum oscillations in enemy. Shield Sierra led the attack again, but this time she didn't aim her weapons manually. Instead, she felt for the weak points in the shields, sensing them through the interface the way a blind person might read Braille. Her missiles struck precisely when the shields cycled to their most vulnerable state, and instead of being absorbed, they punched through and detonated. Against the harvester ship's hull around her, the other interface-equipped vessels were doing the same, hitting targets with precision that seemed impossible because it was impossible for purely mechanical systems. Harvester ship reeled under the coordinated assault, its hull breaching in a dozen locations, inventing atmosphere and biological matter into space. But it didn't die easily. The ship's organic systems began repairing damage almost as fast as the humans could inflict it, and its weapons carved through the human formation with brutal efficiency. "We're hurting it, but we can't kill it." Feeling frustration through the neural link, "We need more firepower or more time." What they got instead was help from an unexpected source. Tyrellian fleet arrived 30 minutes into the battle, their vessels equipped with experimental weapons developed in partnership with human researchers, and began adding their fire to the assault. "We couldn't sit on the sidelines anymore," Ambassador Velkara transmitted from her flagship. "Not when you're fighting for all of us." Dr. Nkosi David approached the damaged Devourer bioship with a mixture of scientific curiosity and existential terror. His small research vessel, dwarfed by the creature's bulk, even though this was just a fragment of a harvester that had been separated during combatha, bioship was still alive in some sense, its organic components pulsing with bioluminescence. Its technological systems whirring and clicking in patterns that suggested awareness behind Nkosi. His team monitored from a safe distance while Admiral Zhao maintained a strike force ready to destroy both the bioship and the research vessel if anything went wrong. Beginning communication attempt. Nkosi transmitted, activating the neural interface system he had modified to broadcast rather than receive, sending patterns of thought and intention toward the alien. Intelligence. Nothing happened for 17 minutes, then something shifted in the bioship's patterns, its lights pulsing in rhythms that matched the frequencies Nkosi was broadcasting, and data began flooding into his neural interface faster than he could consciously process. His team watched in alarm as Nkosi's vital signs spiked, and his body went rigid in the pilot seat. "Pull him out," Lu Fen shouted, reaching for the emergency disconnect. But Nkosi's hand shot out and stopped her with surprising strength. "Wait," he gasped. "I'm receiving something." It's trying to communicate the data resolved into concepts that human language could barely contain. Impressions of vast journeys across empty void between galaxies, of fleeing from something worse than death, of desperation so profound it had driven an entire civilization to become. What they hated the Devourers weren't conquerors or destroyers by nature, they were refugees. 3,000 years ago, their home galaxy had been invaded by entities that existed partially outside normal spacetime, beings that fed on conscious thought and reduced civilizations to mindless husks, and the Devourers had fled into the intergalactic void trying to escape it. Void travel required resources on a scale almost impossible to comprehend, energy and biological matter to sustain their fleet across distances that took centuries to traverse. Even at FTL speeds, they had harvested the first galaxy they encountered because the alternative was death, taking what they needed to survive and moving on before the entities could follow, but the entities had followed, and now the Devourers were fleeing again. And this galaxy was directly in their path. They're not attacking us, Kosi said when he could finally speak coherently again. They're harvesting resources for a journey that has no end because they can't stop running. Admiral Zhao heard this report and felt his strategic calculations shift as he realized they were fighting an enemy that didn't want to be their enemy at all. Can we negotiate? Zhao asked. Can we find a solution that doesn't require them to harvest inhabited worlds? Nkosi wasn't sure, but he was determined to try. And over the next week, he established a rudimentary communication protocol with the bioship's intelligence that allowed concepts to be exchanged with something approaching clarity, the Devourer consciousness. If it could be called that, it was profoundly alien. A collective intelligence spread across billions of organic nodes and thousands of ships, thinking thoughts that took hours to complete and making decisions through processes that resembled ecosystem evolution more than individual choice. But underneath the alienness was something recognizable. Fear and desperation, and a terrible weariness from running for so long. They need resources. Nkosi reported during a strategy session that now included representatives from humanity, the Turellians, and several other species who had quietly joined the fight. Specifically, they need organic compounds for their biological systems, rare elements for their technology, and enormous amounts of energy. How much? Ambassador Chen asked. Already calculating political implications enough to strip mine 50 habitable worlds, Nkosi said. And the room fell silent because that was an impossible demand that no civilization could accept, but Captain Sarah Okonkwo, still connected to her ship through the neural interface that had become a permanent part of her existence, saw a different angle. What if we give them uninhabited worlds? Sarah suggested. The galaxy has thousands of planets rich in resources, but hostile to life. Places we've surveyed but never colonized, because the conditions are too extreme. The idea was radical because it required trusting the Devourers to accept an alternative to harvesting inhabited worlds. But Nkosi thought it might work if they could demonstrate that humanity understood their desperation and wanted to help rather than just fight. The negotiations that followed were the strangest diplomatic exercise in galactic history, conducted through neural interfaces that translated concepts between species separated by fundamental differences in how they experienced. Rielet Nkosi led a contact team that included linguists, xenobiologists, and engineers, all trying to communicate an offer that would seem insane to most observers. Humanity would help the Devourers harvest the resources they needed in exchange for leaving inhabited worlds alone. The Devourer collective consciousness considered this offer for 3 days while battles continued across multiple fronts and casualties mounted on both sides. Then they agreed. The first joint harvesting operation occurred on a planet designated Sigma 7, a massive world with a toxic atmosphere and rich deposits of exactly the elements that Devourers needed most. Human and Devourer ships worked side by side, with humanity providing advanced mining equipment and the Devourers providing organic processing systems that could refine materials with impossible efficiency. Maya Rodriguez found herself on Sigma 7's surface, coordinating the installation of quantum computing systems that would optimize resource extraction, and working directly with Devourer biomachines that looked like nightmares but operated with surprising precision. "This is insane," her Tyrellian colleague Velkara said, watching as a devourer harvester tendril carefully positioned a mining platform exactly where the humans had specified. 6 months ago, we were trying to kill each other. 6 months ago, we didn't understand each other, Maya replied. Fear makes monsters of everyone. The harvesting operation succeeded beyond all projections, extracting enough resources in 2 weeks to supply the devourer fleet for months of void travel, and demonstrating that cooperation was possible between species that seemed too different to coexist. But the Galactic Assembly watched these developments with mounting horror. Vraxian High Commander Turvil called an emergency session and demanded that all species condemn humanity's collaboration with the ancient enemy there, helping the devourers. Turvil raged, his mandibles clicking furiously, teaching them our technologies, showing them our worlds. Betraying every species in the galaxy, Ambassador Chen attended this session via remote connection. Their image projected into the assembly chamber. They had walked out of 7 years earlier, were preventing a war that would cost trillions of lives, Chen said calmly. The Devourers don't want to destroy us. They want to survive. And we found a way for both our species to achieve our goals. You found a way to make deals with monsters, the SAR representative hissed. You've doomed us all. But other voices began rising in the assembly chamber. Species that had watched humanity fight while the elder civilizations argued politics. Species that had seen the neural interface technology and the joint harvesting operations and understood what they represented, perhaps. The humans see something we're too frightened to acknowledge. A representative from the Kalish Compact suggested that the Devourers aren't our ancient enemies anymore. Just desperate refugees who need help. The assembly fractured along lines that had been forming since humanity's withdrawal, with some species supporting the old order and others demanding a new approach. Meanwhile, the war continued for another 2 years, as not all devourer ships could be contacted immediately, and some harvester fleets operated independently. But gradually, the message spread through their collective consciousness that an alternative existed. Dr. Gassé established permanent communication channels between humanity and the Devourer Collective. And what he learned about their ancient flight filled massive databases with information about the intergalactic void and the horrors that lurked there, the entities that had driven the Devourers from their home galaxy, were still out there, still spreading slowly across the cosmos. And eventually they would reach this galaxy too. We need to prepare, Nkosi told Admiral Zhao. The Devourers have been running for 3,000 years, but someday there will be nowhere left to run. Zhao understood the implication. The galaxy needed to unite not just against the immediate threat, but against what was coming in the future, the Devourer. War ended not with a final battle, but with a negotiated settlement that shocked both sides. The Devourers agreed to stop harvesting inhabited worlds and to share their vast knowledge of void travel and ancient technologies. In exchange, humanity and allied species agreed to help them gather the resources they needed, to work on sustainable harvesting techniques that wouldn't strip worlds bare, and to research solutions to the deeper threat that had driven them into exile.